He stood in silence, the weight of the 5-year contract hanging over him like a shroud. To the world, he was nothing more than an invisible servant. He watched the steam rise from the pot, his movements practiced and devoid of pride. The wife swept into the room, her designer blouse bright against the drab interior. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed instead on the glowing screen of her phone. To her, he was merely furniture, a fixture in her life that existed to be ordered around. The air crackled with a sudden, sharp tension. The wife tossed her handbag toward the couch, a gesture of careless entitlement. The silence between them was not peaceful, it was a wall designed to keep him in his place. The CEO arrived, his presence tainting the air of their home. He carried the remnants of a failed business deal, a reckless gamble that he now intended to bury. The protagonist stood in the corner, eyes averted, playing his role perfectly. The wife demanded an apology, her voice dripping with artificial outrage. She pointed at the protagonist, demanding he take the fall for the CEO's gross negligence. He remained still, knowing that a single word of defiance would invite scrutiny he couldn't afford. The CEO smirked, relieved to have found his target. He leaned in close, his predatory gaze heavy with malice. He knew the protagonist had no recourse, trapped by his own engineered poverty. The protagonist offered the apology, his voice low and monotone. Every syllable was calculated to be just pathetic enough to satisfy them. He felt the cold sting of their laughter, a small price for his long-term goal. The mother-in-law swept in, her fur coat heavy with the scent of vanity. She immediately began searching for the protagonist, her eyes scanning for weakness. She lived for the small, stinging humiliation she could inflict upon him. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, immediately demanding his monthly savings. Her tone was sharp, a demand dressed as a household duty. She saw him not as a son-in-law, but as a bank that occasionally needed to be squeezed. The protagonist retreated to the counter, opening a rusted tin box where he kept his meager cash. Each bill he handed over felt like a heavy stone on his conscience. Yet, he surrendered the money without a flicker of hesitation or regret. The mother-in-law snatched the money, her eyes never meeting his. She turned toward the wife, a predatory smile forming on her lips as she pocketed the loot. The protagonist remained in the shadows, his face an unreadable mask of subservience. Inside the bedroom, the CEO began to sweat, his bravado crumbling as he checked the markets. The failed deal was spiraling, and the legal repercussions were looming closer by the second. He needed a distraction, and the wife was all too happy to oblige. The wife started demanding more from the protagonist, her greed fueled by the mother-in-law's earlier success. She wanted expensive jewelry, something to match the status she felt she deserved. The cycle of extraction was accelerating. The protagonist looked out at the city, the skyscrapers reflecting in his calm, grey eyes. He was the only one in the room who knew how fragile their reality truly was. He remained silent, allowing them to believe they had won every encounter. A sharp knock sounded at the door, freezing the trio in their tracks. It was the rival, a shadow from the business world they had all hoped to forget. The atmosphere in the apartment shifted from smug arrogance to cold, sharp terror. The rival stepped inside without invitation, his presence eclipsing everyone else in the room. He didn't look at the wife or the mother-in-law, his eyes immediately locking onto the protagonist. There was a flicker of recognition, a dangerous secret shared in the silence. The CEO tried to intervene, but the rival's icy glare silenced him instantly. The wife cowered behind the mother-in-law, the sudden shift in power rendering them both mute. The protagonist remained in his corner, his silence now feeling like an iron cage. The rival finally spoke, his voice calm and lethal. He addressed the protagonist, his words a direct challenge to the contract's protective veil. The room felt like it was shrinking around the fragile lie the protagonist had maintained for years. The protagonist stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the floor. For the first time, he met the rival's gaze directly, his grey eyes losing their dullness. The air felt charged, a storm ready to break within the confined space of their home. He pulled a single, heavy document from his inner pocket and placed it on the coffee table. It was the contract, its ink dark and final against the glass surface. The wife gasped, the realization dawning on her that she had never known the man she had called a servant. The office is quiet, save for the hum of the ventilation system. A shadow moves quickly, sliding a thick envelope into the bottom drawer. The trap has been set with meticulous, cold precision. He walks into the office, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic. He notices the slight misalignment of the drawer handle. He says nothing, his face a mask of practiced, silent obedience. He doesn't open the drawer. Instead, he turns away, knowing exactly whose fingerprints are on the trap. The game has begun, and he is ready to play the fool. The wife adjusts her jewelry, her face set in a performance of deep, wounded betrayal. She meets her allies to coordinate the public narrative. Her voice is soft, calculated, and sharp. The CEO paces the floor, sweat beading on his forehead as he reviews the forged documents. He is desperate to consolidate power before the audit. He needs a scapegoat, and he has chosen the perfect target. The rival watches from the shadows, his eyes cold and calculating. He sees the CEO's panic and the wife's schemes converging on one man. He remains still, waiting for the blood to be drawn. The protagonist walks past them, his head bowed, carrying a stack of files. He catches a glimpse of their conspiring expressions. He doesn't falter, keeping his rhythm perfectly steady. The CEO summons the protagonist, his voice thick with fake sympathy. He asks for a progress report on the very accounts he plans to claim are stolen. The protagonist agrees, his compliance absolute. The wife cornered him near the water cooler, her face twisted in feigned pity. She tells him to confess before things get worse, hoping to extract a preemptive admission. He remains silent, offering only a polite nod. The mother-in-law confronts him, her voice dripping with venom. She warns him that his marriage is over and his career is finished. He doesn't even blink, his expression as empty as a blank page. Rumors spread like wildfire through the office walls. People whisper, glancing his way with eyes full of mockery. He ignores it all, focusing only on the rhythm of his own breathing. The CEO makes the final call to the board of directors. He is sweating, his confidence slipping as he finalizes the betrayal. He prints the fake files, convinced of his imminent victory. He sits quietly, watching the clock tick down to the meeting time. He checks his watch, a flicker of something ancient and dangerous in his expression. The trap is now fully primed. The wife meets the CEO at the door, sharing a brief, triumphant look. They enter together, a united front ready to destroy a man they believe is defenseless. The stage is set for the final humiliation. He follows them in, his demeanor perfectly subservient. He takes his seat at the far end of the long table. The air is thick with anticipation and the scent of expensive cologne. The CEO stands, slamming a file onto the table. He begins his speech, his voice booming with fake indignation. He accuses the protagonist of grand larceny, his finger pointed directly at his chest. The wife adds her testimony, her voice cracking with performative sobs. The board members murmur, their faces turning towards the protagonist with disgust. He sits perfectly still, refusing to defend himself. The CEO demands the protagonist hand over his badge and security clearance. The protagonist stands, moving with a sudden, eerie grace. He reaches into his jacket, not for the documents, but for his phone. He hits send on his phone. Instantly, every screen in the room turns black, then flashes with a single, glowing red notification. The CEO's face goes pale as the truth hits the screens. The protagonist rises, his posture changing. He is taller, sharper, more dangerous. He looks at his wife, then at the CEO, his voice cold and clear. The 5-year contract is finally void. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. The protagonist sat perfectly still, his hands folded neatly on the cold metal surface. He was not waiting for an attorney, but for a signal that the 5-year clock had finally struck midnight. A phone rang, piercing through the precinct's chaotic atmosphere like a gunshot. The captain picked up the receiver, his expression shifting from annoyance to pure, unfiltered terror as he listened to the voice on the other end. He dropped the phone, his face drained of all color. The iron bolt slid back with a grating screech that echoed down the hallway. Guards who had treated the protagonist like garbage only an hour ago now stepped back, heads bowed in sudden deference. He rose slowly, smoothing out the frayed cuffs of his shirt as if stepping into a kingdom. He bypassed the security protocols with the ease of a man walking through his own front door. His fingers danced across the holographic interface, routing assets through dozens of shell companies. Each transfer was a surgical strike against the empire that thought it had shackled him. The CEO stared at his screens, watching the ticker symbols turn red in real time. Millions were hemorrhaging from his accounts, vanishing into digital voids he couldn't track. He roared in frustration, overturning a glass of expensive scotch onto his mahogany desk. The wife stood frozen as her credit card was declined for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Panic began to claw at her throat, replacing her usual arrogant facade with something much sharper. She frantically checked her banking app, only to find a balance of 0. The mother-in-law entered the room, her voice a sharp demand for service that went unanswered. She found the house unnervingly quiet, a stark departure from the usual bustling staff. Her face twisted into a mask of indignation as she realized nobody was coming to cater to her whims. The rival watched the market data, his icy eyes narrowed in suspicion as he noted the strange movement of capital. He recognized the pattern, a ghost from the past he thought had been buried 5 years ago. His knuckles drummed against the glass table, a signal of his growing agitation. The protagonist stepped out into the night air, the cool breeze a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the police station. He adjusted his collar, his shadow long and imposing against the wet brick walls. He took a single breath, savoring the taste of absolute freedom. The CEO frantically dialed his associates, his voice cracking under the weight of his mounting debt. Everyone was either unavailable or pretending they didn't know his name. He realized then that he wasn't just losing money, he was being erased. The wife marched toward her husband's office, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. Her anger was a shield, masking the dread that had started to settle in her stomach. She was ready to demand answers for the strange warnings appearing on her accounts. She burst through the doors, only to find the CEO standing in the center of the room, looking utterly defeated. He didn't even look at her, his eyes fixed on the empty screen of his main terminal. The life they had curated so carefully was crumbling to dust. The mother-in-law was frantically shoving jewelry into a small leather bag. Her hands shook, causing a diamond necklace to snag on the lace of her nightgown. She knew if the money vanished, the facade of their family's prestige would vanish with it. The rival stepped out of his car, his movements fluid and predatory. He had tracked the digital footprints to this specific location, a private terminal used by high-level insiders. He wasn't just looking for money, he was looking for the man he intended to break. The protagonist paused, sensing a presence nearby. He didn't panic. he simply hit enter, finalizing the last transfer of the corporate assets into his private trust. The screen flickered, a success message displayed in elegant, cold typeface. The door swung open with a heavy thud, revealing the rival standing there. He expected to see a desperate hacker, but instead, he found the protagonist sitting calmly, checking his watch. The air in the room grew heavy with the collision of two titans. The rival stepped forward, a smug grin forming on his lips as he prepared to dismantle the protagonist. He began to speak, but the protagonist cut him off with a single, icy look that stopped him in his tracks. The power dynamic shifted, leaving the rival looking suddenly small. The protagonist stood up, revealing a height and presence the rival hadn't anticipated. He walked past the rival, not even bothering to look at him as he exited the room. The rival stood paralyzed, his own ambition turning into a trap he couldn't escape. The CEO and his wife met the protagonist in the center of the lobby, surrounded by onlookers. The CEO lunged forward, but the protagonist didn't even flinch. He simply held up a single, black digital key, the symbol of the company's new ownership. He handed the key to the wife, watching as her face crumbled in realization of what it meant. She looked down at the key, then back at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning understanding. The 5-year contract was over, and the war was only just beginning. The morning sun cut through the glass, illuminating the frantic footsteps of junior analysts. Chaos reigned as the digital ticker on the wall flickered red, signaling a massive, unauthorized transfer. No one noticed the man in the faded, ill-fitting shirt standing near the revolving doors. Inside the executive suite, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and desperation. The CEO slammed his fist against the mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white. He stared at the blank screens that moments ago held his empire's fortune. A sharp knock echoed through the room, but the CEO was too paralyzed to answer. The protagonist stood in the hallway, clutching a stack of discarded files. He watched the man who once humiliated him descend into a frantic, spiraling panic. The protagonist walked past the glass wall with deliberate, slow steps. He adjusted his fraying cuffs, a gesture of practiced insignificance. He was an invisible gear in a machine he now owned entirely. The wife stood by the elevators, her expensive silk blouse strained as she fumbled with her phone. She was frantic, unaware that her luxury lifestyle had just been stripped away by an anonymous shell company. She didn't spare a glance for the servant walking by. The CEO shouted into his phone, demanding answers from offshore banks that had already severed ties. His desk was littered with legal documents, now useless paper. He was hunting for a ghost he couldn't name. The protagonist stopped to fill a plastic cup with water, his movements rhythmic and steady. He heard the muffled screams of the CEO from the hallway. He drank, feeling the cold liquid wash away 5 years of silence. The mother-in-law arrived, her fur coat heavy, her expression one of cold entitlement. She sought the CEO to demand funds for an upcoming gala. She looked past the protagonist as if he were furniture. The CEO emerged, his eyes wild and unfocused, nearly colliding with the protagonist. He didn't see the man who owned his debts, he only saw an obstacle to his escape. He shoved the protagonist aside without a word. Hidden away in the quiet, the protagonist accessed a terminal. With a few keystrokes, he locked the CEO out of the final liquidity accounts. He remained the silent observer, his net worth hidden behind ironclad privacy walls. The rival arrived, walking with the heavy, calculated steps of a shark. He had smelled the blood in the water. He didn't acknowledge anyone, his gaze fixed on the executive floor with predatory hunger. The CEO collapsed into his chair as the rival entered without permission. The air in the room grew heavy, the power dynamic shifting in an instant. The rival smiled, a gesture devoid of warmth. The wife watched the rival enter the office from a distance, her intuition warning her of danger. She pulled at her gold necklace, her poise beginning to crack under the weight of the unknown. Everything she built was slipping away. The protagonist hovered nearby, a shadow in a cheap uniform. He watched the rival, knowing the man was walking into a phantom market crash. The irony was sweet, kept locked behind his practiced, empty face. The CEO tried to stand, but his legs failed him. He was losing control of his board, his staff, and his sanity. The rival leaned in, whispering something that broke the remaining shell of the CEO's resolve. The wife burst into the room, her composure finally shattered. She demanded to know who had initiated the sell-off. The CEO just stared at her, his mind empty and broken, unable to offer an answer. The mother-in-law entered, gasping at the sight of her son-in-law's defeat. She clutched her pendant, the symbol of her status now worth nothing. The power dynamic in the room was irrevocably shattered. The protagonist stepped forward, finally breaking his silence. He didn't look at them as equals, he looked at them as a man looks at old, broken toys. He held a single, crisp document in his hand. The CEO looked up, finally focusing on the man he had ignored for years. He saw the shift in posture, the coldness in the eyes, a man he didn't recognize. The document hit the desk with a sound like a gavel. The silence in the room was deafening. The protagonist smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes, it was the smile of a predator that had finally been released from its cage. Everything was about to change. The wife stares at her reflection, her hands trembling as she runs them over the fabric of her favorite couture gown. It feels brittle, like cheap paper. She knows this dress cost a fortune, yet the stitching unravels at the slightest tug. The illusion of her perfect life is starting to fray at the edges. The protagonist sits in the corner, his back turned to the door, observing the chaos through a small mirror. He keeps his expression flat, neutral, and entirely devoid of life. He knows the contract requires silence, and silence is the deadliest weapon he possesses. He watches her panic grow with clinical detachment. The CEO reaches for the brass handle of the lounge, expecting the usual deferential treatment from the staff. Instead, the door remains locked, its heavy frame immovable. The digital display flashes a jarring red alert, denying his credentials. His world is suddenly becoming very small. The wife turns on her husband, her blue eyes sharp with sudden, irrational fury. She demands to know why her designer assets are failing. She refuses to believe that her social standing is slipping. Her voice echoes against the marble countertops. The protagonist says nothing, merely continuing to polish the silverware with rhythmic, obsessive precision. His silence is like a wall, frustrating her even further. He offers no defense and no explanation, keeping his zero net worth cover perfectly intact. He is merely an object in her eyes, beneath notice. The CEO paces the length of his office, his phone pressed firmly against his ear. He is shouting into the receiver, but the silence on the other end confirms his worst fears. Even his closest subordinates are no longer answering his calls. He is being erased from the corporate network. The mother-in-law enters, her face twisted in indignation as she spots the discarded clothes piled on the rug. She views the situation as a personal insult to her family's name. She doesn't see a tragedy, she sees an inconvenience. She blames the wife for not maintaining appearances. The wife snaps back, her composure finally breaking into sharp, jagged edges. She yells about the lack of support and the sudden isolation they are all facing. Her golden jewelry feels like chains now. The house that once felt like a palace now feels like a cage. The protagonist leans against the cold wall, listening to the muffled shouting from the living room. He glances at his watch, noting the time remaining on his firm's restrictive contract. He is waiting for the precise moment when the house of cards collapses completely. He remains a shadow, unnoticed and unbothered. The CEO bangs his fists against the steering wheel, his breathing heavy and ragged. He tries to access his offshore accounts, but the screen displays a persistent error. He realizes he has been locked out of his own life. The silence of the garage is suffocating. The mother-in-law grabs the wife's arm, forcing her to acknowledge the reality of their situation. She demands to know where the money went, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper. She isn't concerned with the wife's welfare, only her own plummeting status. The greed is palpable in the room. The wife pulls away, accusing the mother-in-law of being the one who spent the reserves on her own vanity projects. She points at the diamonds, mocking their value now that the company is failing. Their domestic relationship has completely devolved into a power struggle for the scraps. The CEO enters, his face flushed with uncharacteristic panic. He slams the door behind him, his presence disrupting the tense standoff between the two women. He looks like a man who has lost everything and is desperate to blame someone. The tension in the room hits a breaking point. They all converge, pointing fingers in a chaotic circle of accusation. The CEO blames the wife's spending, she blames his mismanagement, the mother-in-law blames both for their incompetence. None of them notice the silent figure watching from the shadows of the doorway. The cycle of blame is their own trap. The protagonist steps forward just an inch, his face partially caught in a beam of light. His expression is one of hollow calm. He remains the silent observer, his net worth zero, his profile invisible. He is the catalyst they never saw coming. The CEO grabs the protagonist by the collar, dragging him into the light. He screams at him for being lazy and useless, venting his frustration physically. He expects a cowering reaction, but the protagonist's body remains limp and unaffected. He is essentially attacking a stone. The wife watches in stunned silence, realizing the protagonist hasn't blinked in minutes. There is no fear in his eyes, only a hollow void that unnerves her more than any shout. The power dynamic shifts in an instant, though only the protagonist knows why. She takes a hesitant step backward. The protagonist pushes the CEO's hand away with a single, practiced movement. It is not an act of aggression, but of profound, unsettling detachment. He walks toward the door, his movements fluid and precise. The family is left frozen in the middle of their own chaos. As he reaches for the door, the protagonist pauses, his hand hovering over the lock. He does not turn around, but he speaks into the silence. His voice is cold, clear, and utterly unrecognizable to them. The atmosphere in the room drops several degrees in an instant. He opens the door to reveal a man in a sharp gray suit standing on the other side. The visitor bows deeply to the protagonist, acknowledging him as the true owner of the firm. The family watches in horror as the veil of the servant falls away to reveal a predator. The silent observer has finally arrived. The CEO leaned back, his laughter echoing off the cold glass. He saw only a penniless servant standing before him, not a man who controlled his entire firm's liquidity. The termination papers lay waiting like a death sentence. The protagonist reached out with a steady hand. He didn't speak, his silence a shield for the billions he held in the dark. He picked up the fountain pen with deliberate slowness. As the final signature bloomed across the document, the air in the room seemed to thin. The CEO froze, his mirth vanishing instantly. He had signed his own professional execution. The wife marched toward the double doors, her heels clicking like a countdown. She had arrived to gloat, expecting to see her husband tossed out on the street. Her expression was a mask of cold anticipation. She threw the door open, ready to deliver the final insult. Instead, she found the room suffocating in an unnatural, heavy silence. The CEO stood trembling near the window. The CEO could not even look at her, his hands gripping the mahogany edge of his desk. He looked like a man watching his life's work dissolve into ash. The protagonist stood perfectly still, his eyes devoid of any triumph. She stepped forward, clutching her purse. "What have you done?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the stifling tension. She ignored the protagonist, focusing entirely on the broken man before her. The CEO pointed a shaking finger at the man in the faded shirt. "He owns it all," he rasped, his voice barely audible. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. The wife turned slowly, her blue eyes narrowing in disbelief. She looked at the man she had treated as a servant for years. Her model-like face contorted with a flicker of genuine shock. The protagonist adjusted his cuffs, his expression remaining neutral and detached. He looked no different than the day he started his contract. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on the woman who thought she was safe. She snatched the papers from the desk, her manicured fingers trembling. As she read the transfer details, the foundation of her world began to crumble. Everything she took for granted was legally, irrevocably gone. She turned to the protagonist, her voice rising in a jagged, desperate pitch. She begged for an explanation, for a lie, for anything but the truth. The protagonist remained silent, his gaze fixed on a point behind her shoulder. The CEO collapsed into his leather chair, a hollow man. He was no longer a person of authority, but a discarded tool. The shift in power was absolute. The protagonist finally moved, stepping toward the door with a calm, measured pace. He paused, his shadow stretching across the floor to touch the wife's designer shoes. He still hadn't said a single word. The wife lunged forward, grabbing his sleeve, her composure entirely shattered. She was now the one begging, and he was the one in command. The irony was as sharp as the edges of the room. He gently removed her hand from his arm, his fingers cold and detached. He leaned in, finally breaking his silence just to whisper a single, chilling truth into her ear. Her eyes widened, realizing the game had been over long ago. As he pulled away, she fell back, losing her grip on her pride entirely. The CEO watched them, unable to process the shifting tides of his own life. The office, once a fortress, was now a tomb for their ambition. He walked out of the office, his back perfectly straight, leaving them in the wreckage of their own making. He hadn't changed his clothes, he hadn't raised his voice, yet the world had shifted. The silent observer was finally ready to speak. A figure emerged from the shadows of the corridor, his eyes cold and familiar. It was the rival, waiting for the exact moment the protagonist would emerge. He knew the secrets that remained hidden. The two men stood face to face, the air charged with an electric tension. The rival smiled, a gesture that held no warmth and all the threat in the world. The real war was just beginning. The locks clicked shut with a finality that echoed through the empty hall. Gone were the servants, the velvet curtains, and the prestige of a name once feared. The protagonist stood in the center, his meager bag the only remnant of a life he never truly owned. The wife stood on the cracked pavement, her expensive heels sinking into the grit. She clutched a singular designer handbag, the last token of a status now stripped away. Around them, the neighborhood watched with cold, judgmental silence. A crowd gathered at the perimeter, their phones held high to capture the fall of the city's golden couple. There was no pity in the flashing lights, only a hunger for ruin. The protagonist adjusted his collar, hiding a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. The gilded doors of the club remained shut as they approached. The doorman did not even look up, his posture rigid and dismissive. Even here, in the heart of their former circle, they were now ghosts, invisible to those they once called peers. The wife collapsed against the damp brick wall, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She looked at the protagonist, expecting a solution, a miracle, or at least a protest. She found nothing but the quiet, rhythmic tapping of his fingers on his worn sleeves. Giant digital screens suddenly flickered to life, showing their faces plastered across the morning news. The headlines were brutal, dissecting their bankruptcy with surgical precision. The protagonist didn't flinch as his own name was dragged through the digital mud. The mother-in-law cornered them, her voice a sharp blade cutting through the silence. She spat accusations, her hands trembling with an indignation that bordered on hysteria. The protagonist sat still, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his cheap cup. The CEO stared at the ledger, his hands shaking as he realized the funds were gone. He threw his phone against the mahogany desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The empire was hemorrhaging, and the culprit was nowhere to be found. The protagonist and the wife descended into the bowels of the city, hidden among the commuters. The anonymity was a double-edged sword. They were finally safe, but completely stripped of their identity. She covered her face, unable to bear the touch of the common crowd. The rival watched the news from his high-rise perch, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. He poured a drink, his eyes fixed on the footage of their disgrace. He sensed something was wrong, a tremor in the logic of their fall, but he couldn't pinpoint it. They signed the lease for a studio apartment that smelled of damp and failure. The protagonist counted out the last of their cash, his movements fluid and precise. He didn't look at the wife as she wept, his mission required a heart of stone. The windows were barred, and the walls were paper-thin, vibrating with the sounds of the city. The wife sat on the edge of the mattress, looking at her bare hands, now devoid of rings. She was a bird that had lost its wings, grounded by the weight of their fall. In the dead of night, the protagonist finally allowed his mask to slip. He reached under the floorboard, revealing an encrypted drive that held the key to the firm's true assets. He kept his breathing steady, knowing the slightest deviation would trigger the hostile takeover. He browsed the stock market with an intensity that burned the screen. Millions moved behind the scenes, redirected into shell accounts that officially did not exist. Every trade was invisible, a ghost in the machine that kept his net worth at zero. The CEO arrived unexpectedly, pounding on the door until the frame groaned. He was desperate, his eyes bloodshot, demanding answers the protagonist couldn't give. The protagonist opened the door just a crack, his face an impenetrable wall. They were called in for a final audit, the last step in the systematic dismantling of their influence. The rival stood waiting, flanked by lawyers who looked ready to strip the flesh from their bones. It was the moment of truth, the culmination of the plan. The board members turned in unison as they entered, their faces masks of cold judgment. Papers were slammed onto the table, the final severance documents. The protagonist felt the familiar weight of the room, the scent of expensive cologne and blood. The rival stepped forward, reaching for the documents, his fingers twitching with anticipation. He thought he had won, that the protagonist was finally destroyed. But as he looked up, he saw the protagonist's grey eyes change, shifting from dull to piercing. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The only sound was the clicking of a laptop initiating a massive, unauthorized file transfer. A cold, steady voice echoed in the blackness, finally breaking the long silence. The firm's servers went red, crashing in sequence as the true assets were wiped from the company's ledger. The protagonist walked out of the room, leaving the rival and the CEO screaming at blank monitors. He had played the game perfectly, now, the real game began. The morning sun casts long, jagged shadows across the polished granite floor. Security guards struggle to hold back a swarm of process servers and aggressive lawyers. The air is thick with a metallic scent of tension and impending ruin. He sits quietly behind a mountain of paperwork, a ghost in his own company. To the outside world, he is a menial clerk. He watches the chaos, his eyes calculating the exact moment his facade will shatter. A sharp, frantic knock echoes through the hallway, but no one answers. The CEO is a caged animal, his authority evaporating with every passing second. He knows his mistakes have finally caught up to him. The wife paces the narrow galley kitchen, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. She is frantic, unaware that her husband is watching her from the doorway. Her designer blouse is wrinkled, a stark contrast to her usual polished appearance. The protagonist steps from the shadows, his presence barely noted by those consumed by panic. He watches her struggle, his silence a shield against her predictable outbursts. He knows exactly where the offshore assets are hidden, and he isn't sharing. The rival stalks through the halls, a predator closing in on a wounded pack. He stops, sensing eyes upon him, but sees only a nameless clerk. He dismisses the protagonist with a cold, haughty glance. She stares at the ticker on the wall, her jewelry heavy and mocking in the dim light. The news of the hostile takeover has reached her, and she is furious at the impending loss of status. Her judgmental eyes scan the room, looking for someone to blame. The protagonist retrieves a cup of coffee, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He ignores the shouting matches erupting in the hallway. To him, the chaos is simply noise in a larger, orchestrated symphony. The CEO tosses his phone onto the desk, the device shattering against the glass. He grips his hair, realizing the lawyers have frozen the operating accounts. He is effectively bankrupt, and he has no idea how it happened. The wife encounters the rival, and the air turns icy. She tries to maintain her composure, but her voice trembles with the weight of her impending fall. He dismisses her, his gaze already searching for the next piece of leverage. The protagonist slips inside the restricted records area, moving with the fluidity of someone who owns the building. He finds the physical ledger he needs, hidden behind a stack of defunct files. One flick of his wrist and the evidence disappears forever. The lawyers are demanding proof of ownership for the shell companies, but the folders are empty. The protagonist has stripped them bare, leaving behind only dust and disappointment. The rival slams his hand on the table, sensing he has been played. She screams at her daughter over the phone, the sound echoing in the opulent room. Her sense of entitlement is being challenged, and she is reacting with pure, venomous rage. Everything she built is crumbling, and she has nowhere to run. The protagonist climbs the stairs, his pace measured, his breathing perfectly regulated. He passes the fleeing staff, a man moving against the tide. He isn't fleeing, he's ascending to witness the final act of the tragedy. He pauses outside the office, hearing the sound of the CEO destroying his own equipment. The internal destruction is the final piece of the protagonist's plan. By the time the lawyers arrive, there will be nothing left to take. The wind howls as the CEO attempts to escape, his desperation plain on his face. He is caught by the rival, who is waiting for him with a cold, hollow smile. The final confrontation for the last of the liquid assets begins in the freezing air. The wife arrives, breathless and shivering, clutching her coat. She sees the men, the money, and the ruin of her entire life. She realizes in that moment that she has been used as a pawn by everyone involved. The protagonist steps onto the roof, the quiet observer no longer hidden. He doesn't look like a servant anymore, he looks like the architect of the downfall. He walks past them all, his presence radiating an authority that freezes them in their tracks. He opens his hand, showing a single, small black thumb drive. The rival stares at it, his face crumbling from arrogance to absolute terror. The fate of every asset, every dollar, is contained on that single piece of plastic. He moves to the edge, the wind whipping his coat, and holds the drive out over the city lights. One drop, and the financial system of this firm evaporates forever. The screen fades to black as he begins to let go. The stock ticker flickers with volatile red lines, reflecting the chaos of a market in free fall. Behind the glowing monitor, the protagonist remains a statue of artificial poverty. His desk is buried in mundane paperwork, masking the digital empire pulsating beneath his fingertips. The CEO paces his plush office, his expensive suit rumpled by the stress of the collapsing market. He watches the fluctuations with a predatory hunger, convinced that the target is finally buckling under the pressure of the conglomerate's massive liquidity injection. He doesn't realize he is hunting a ghost. In the safety of her penthouse, the mother-in-law pours a glass of vintage wine, her eyes fixed on the financial news. She expresses vocal disgust at the protagonist's supposed failures, her thin lips curled in a permanent sneer. She treats his financial ruin as a personal affront to her status. The rival watches the conglomerate's aggression, his icy eyes dissecting every erratic shift in the equity values. He senses a strange anomaly in the trading patterns, a phantom buyer absorbing the conglomerate's pressure. His fingers tap a slow, rhythmic beat against the mahogany surface. The wife stares at her account balances, her frustration boiling over as her investments plummet alongside the conglomerate's strategy. She blames the protagonist for his lack of wealth, her blue eyes sharp and unforgiving. She demands answers that she is too arrogant to perceive. The protagonist monitors the sell orders, his fingers flying across the keys in a blur of silent activity. He is selling off his useless shell assets, deliberately creating a vacuum of liquidity for the conglomerate to fill. His expression remains utterly blank, a masterpiece of professional indifference. The CEO's phone erupts with notifications, indicating a massive spike in asset acquisition. He interprets the volume as a surrender, his face lighting up with greed as he authorizes even more capital injections. He prepares to swallow the assets whole, blinded by the perceived weakness. The protagonist overhears the corporate gossip, his face displaying a rehearsed, sheepish smile. He acts the part of the downtrodden servant, accepting casual insults from his superiors with a bow. Inside, he is calculating the exact moment his assets will peak in value. The rival stares at the data trends, the lines finally forming a pattern he recognizes. He realizes the protagonist's shell assets are not worthless, but are in fact perfectly positioned to destabilize the market. His frustration grows, as he finds himself unable to stop the conglomerate from walking into the fire. The wife is in a frantic state, checking her dwindling bank status on her phone as the market fluctuates. She tries to call the CEO, her hand shaking as she realizes the volatility is hurting her personal investments. Her arrogance begins to erode into genuine panic. The mother-in-law watches the ticker with a growing, cold dread as her luxury holdings begin to tumble. She paces the floor, her diamond pendants clinking softly, reflecting the nervousness in her hands. She starts to demand answers from the staff, unaware that the real architect is invisible to her. Under the neon lights of the city, the protagonist walks with a steady, unhurried pace. He passes the conglomerate headquarters, glancing up at the glowing logo with utter lack of interest. He is the master of this domain, moving in the shadows while everyone else looks at the light. The CEO slams his fist onto his desk, his eyes bloodshot and wide with panic. The market has completely reversed, and the liquidity he poured into the protagonist's assets is trapped in a sinking ship. He begins to realize he has been systematically dismantled from within. The rival meets the CEO in the hallway, his face a mask of cold fury and calculated indifference. He speaks nothing, but his intense gaze cuts through the CEO's desperate excuses. He knows exactly who orchestrated this collapse, and he is terrified of the protagonist's reach. The protagonist quietly closes his laptop, his tasks completed for the night. He stands up to leave, his movements precise and unremarkable, ignoring the chaos erupting around the office floor. He is the quiet ghost in the machine, satisfied with the damage he has wrought. The wife finds the mother-in-law in a state of near collapse, the wealth they flaunted vanishing before their eyes. They scream and argue, blaming everyone but themselves for the financial disaster. The protagonist arrives home, stepping into their chaotic environment with perfect composure. The wife turns her fury toward the protagonist, demanding to know where he has been during the crash. She reaches out to grab his collar, but he gently intercepts her hand, his gray eyes turning cold. For the first time, she sees something in his eyes that scares her, an intelligence that outweighs her own. The mother-in-law watches from the threshold, her face pale as she recognizes the shift in power. The protagonist says nothing, merely walking past them with a terrifying aura of quiet dominance. He remains a servant in appearance, but his actions have now silenced the entire household. The protagonist retrieves a hidden document, a contract that marks his 5-year wait as complete. He looks at the date, a slight smile forming on his lips. His public profile as the poor servant is about to vanish, replaced by the man he was always meant to be. The protagonist walks out the door, abandoning the uniform he despised. He takes a deep breath, the cold night air signaling a new, dangerous era. He is no longer a servant, no longer a ghost, he is coming to reclaim everything. The board members sat in suffocating silence as the final document slid across the mahogany table. The CEO's era was over, and the company was bleeding value by the second. The stock price was plummeting, dragging the entire reputation of the conglomerate into the abyss. The mother-in-law paced the corridor, her diamond necklace glinting under the clinical lights. She knew the board's decision would destroy their family's standing in the elite circles. Her fingers clutched her handbag until her knuckles turned white. The protagonist watched through a cracked door, his expression entirely devoid of emotion. He adjusted his fraying cuffs, perfectly blending into the background as he had for 5 long years. The collapse of the conglomerate was exactly the opportunity he had been waiting for. The CEO threw a glass across the room, watching it shatter against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He screamed at the empty air, cursed the board, and cursed his luck. Outside, the city lights mocked his sudden descent into professional obscurity. He pulled up the trading dashboard on a rusted, old monitor. The stocks were tanking faster than even he had anticipated, hitting record lows every few minutes. He watched the numbers tumble with the patience of a predator stalking wounded prey. The wife walked through the crowd, her smile brittle and fake as she overheard the whispers. Every person she looked at seemed to be discussing her family's inevitable bankruptcy. She tightened her grip on her champagne flute, fighting to keep her composure. The rival sat in his leather chair, watching the ticker tape move across his private terminal. He knew someone was buying the shares, but he couldn't trace the shell companies. The mystery infuriated him, as he had planned to pick up the assets for pennies himself. Panic was infectious as the trading floor descended into chaos. The protagonist, dressed in his plain uniform, moved through the aisles unnoticed while dropping off heavy files. He kept his head down, never meeting the gaze of the frantic traders running past him. The mother-in-law cornered the protagonist, her face twisted in rage as she accused him of being useless during the crisis. He listened in silence, his head slightly bowed, effectively acting the part of a bumbling, incompetent son-in-law. Her words washed over him, completely meaningless. The protagonist bypassed the security protocols with ease, his fingers dancing across the console. Every move was calculated to funnel the conglomerate's remaining liquidity into his untraceable holding entities. He didn't blink as the billions flowed into his digital coffers. The wife met with her attorney, demanding to know how they could save their remaining personal fortune. The attorney offered only grim news, confirming the assets were tied up in the firm's failing stock. She realized then that the walls were closing in for real. The CEO sat in the dark, the silence louder than the boardroom shouting had been. He looked at his phone, his hands trembling as he checked the share price one last time. It was effectively zero, and he was the one who had facilitated the total destruction. The rival paced the stairs, his frustration boiling over as he realized he had lost the race to acquire the shares. He slammed his fist into the concrete wall, the sound echoing through the shaft. He knew this was a masterclass in hostile acquisition. The protagonist poured a cup of lukewarm coffee, listening to the gossip about the company's collapse. He nodded along, his face a perfect mask of simple-minded ignorance. Behind his dull stare, he was mentally marking the final countdown until he would take ownership. The wife tried to return her designer items, but the manager coldly refused the transaction. The realization that her status card was declined in public left her reeling with embarrassment. She stood frozen, unable to process the total loss of her societal leverage. The protagonist entered the boardroom, no longer carrying a tray or files. He sat down at the center of the table, his posture changing instantly. The air in the room seemed to shift as he discarded the mask he had worn for 5 years. The rival arrived at the main headquarters only to find the security doors locked to his access card. A cold fear gripped him as he realized the takeover was already complete. The name on the property deeds had been changed overnight. The CEO found a single document left on his desk, an invitation to a meeting he knew he wouldn't survive. It was signed by an anonymous shell entity. He fell into his chair, realizing he was now a pauper facing a titan. The wife waited in the dark, her clothes disheveled and her heart racing. She was supposed to meet the anonymous investor, hoping to beg for her family's survival. A pair of polished shoes stepped into the light, stopping just inches from her own. She looked up, expecting a stranger, but her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the man standing before her. The servant, her husband, was looking at her not with servitude, but with cold, absolute authority. The 5 years of silence were over, and the true cost was only beginning to dawn. The air in the grand hallway hung heavy, thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken resentment. A single shadow stretched across the marble, long and cold. The protagonist stood motionless, watching the family retreat into their gilded cage. The family gathered for dinner, blissfully unaware that their golden era was burning to the ground. Every clinking of silverware echoed like a countdown. They toasted to wealth that technically no longer existed. The protagonist didn't announce his presence with a shout, but with the cold, rhythmic clicking of his heels. The jovial atmosphere died instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence. He held a thick file, the weight of their demise. He slid the bankruptcy declaration across the mahogany surface with a grace that bordered on cruel. The CEO stared at the documents, his face turning a sickly, pale gray. Reality had finally arrived to collect its dues. The wife stood up, her composure fracturing under the weight of the accusations written in black and white. She tried to deny it, but her words died in her throat as she saw the paper trail. Every lie she had told was catalogued and bound. The mother-in-law clutched her necklace, the diamonds now looking like iron shackles around her neck. She looked toward the protagonist for mercy, but found only the vacant, icy stare of a man who had suffered for 5 long years. There was no pity to be found here. The rival stormed in, his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic energy. He knew what these documents meant for his own illicit offshore holdings. He wanted to scream, but the protagonist remained a statue of professional resolve. The CEO tried to threaten him, pointing a finger that trembled like a dry leaf in a gale. The protagonist simply checked his watch, a subtle gesture that told them their time had expired. The countdown wasn't just a metaphor anymore. Law enforcement sirens began to wail in the distance, a haunting chorus for their downfall. The wife fell to her knees, the silk of her blouse catching on a splintered chair. She finally understood the scope of the debt. The rival grabbed the desk, leaning forward to plead, to bargain, to beg. He offered anything, his soul included, but the protagonist just turned away. He didn't want their money, he wanted their complete removal from the board. The mother-in-law watched as their staff began to strip the home of its art, following the new court-mandated seizure. The opulence they lived for was being hauled away like common refuse. Every piece of history was being erased in seconds. The CEO clawed at the air, his composure utterly shattered by the weight of the impending indictments. He looked like a man who had finally realized he was playing a game he never truly understood. He was simply a pawn being discarded by the board. The protagonist stood in the center of the chaos, a pillar of calm amidst the storm. He witnessed their desperate movements without a single flicker of emotion. He was the architect of this ruin, and he felt nothing but the satisfaction of a contract fulfilled. The wife tried to corner him on the stairs, clutching the hem of his jacket. She screamed about their marriage, about the life they built, but he didn't even blink. He looked through her, as if she were a ghost in a place he no longer inhabited. The rival blocked the door, his posture broken and his gaze frantic. He demanded to know how the protagonist had managed it, how he had hidden his worth for so long. The silence in response was the most cutting answer of all. The protagonist produced the final restraining order, the paper held in a grip of iron. He handed it to the CEO, his eyes locking onto his with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just a legal document, it was a permanent eviction from his life. The family stood before the threshold, their world outside the mansion looking cold and unfamiliar. They had nowhere left to run, and their influence had dissolved into the wind. They were now just ordinary, broken people standing in the rain. The protagonist watched the door swing shut, the lock clicking home with finality. He adjusted his cuff, finally stepping out of the role he had worn for 5 long years. The shadow was gone, and the predator had been revealed. He walked to a hidden wall safe, the code rolling off his tongue with ease. Inside was the true portfolio, the foundation of a global empire that had existed in secret for years. The final piece was missing, and his eyes searched the documents for a name. A photograph slid out from the back of the safe, a woman he thought was dead, holding a key he recognized all too well. His calm finally shattered, his hands gripping the edge of the safe until his knuckles turned white. The game wasn't over, it was only just beginning.